16 years. 16 years of living under the thumb of a Russian puppet, and Hungarians finally decided that they've had enough. They turned out in record numbers and booted Viktor Orbán to the curb. And his defeat was so definitive, so unquestionable that he conceded in 3 hours. It was a victory that was too big to rig. And considering that Orbán is Putin's favorite puppet and the key force in Europe, allowing for Putin to operate in the former Soviet states and topple those governments in favor of puppet regimes, this is a massive victory for the Hungarian people. Or is it? What can we learn from the rise and fall of Viktor Orbán that we need to pay attention to as the new leadership takes shape? To get everybody caught up, and this is reporting from NPR, in a stunning turn of events, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán lost his bid for a fifth consecutive term on Sunday after voters turned out in numbers not seen since the fall of communism in the 1990s. Voters, largely fueled by concerns about entrenched government corruption, overwhelmingly chose Peter Magyar, a 45-year-old lawyer and politician who until several years ago was a staunch Orbán loyalist. He burst onto the scene as an opposition leader in 2024, rising rapidly to become leader of the center-right TISA party, which won a 2/3 majority in Sunday's parliamentary election. Orbán, who's led Hungary for 16 years, conceded and congratulated Magyar less than 3 hours after polls closed. In his victory speech, Magyar told supporters on the banks of the Danube that he promises to rebuild Hungary's ties to the European Union and NATO and root out corruption and cronyism and restore the system of checks and balances. There's a massive incentive for Hungary to do that, because since 2022, the EU has frozen billions of dollars of Hungarian assets because of Orbán's corruption. So everything seems to be set up for a complete turnaround for Hungary. But here's where we need to exercise some caution. The rise of Magyar, the new leader of Hungary, has some really interesting parallels to how Viktor Orbán actually rose to power as well. Back in '89, Viktor Orbán stood in Heroes Square and demanded that Soviet troops leave Hungary. That was his brand. He was young, he was anti-communist, he was anti-Russian, he was defiant. Now when you look at him, the same guy who ended up pointing the finger at Russia and pointing the finger at Putin and all of their illiberal models ended up being the biggest puppet for Moscow. That has all the hallmarks of somebody who does and says whatever he can to maintain power. When you look at Orbán's biography, this is not the story of somebody that has deep principles. It's a story of a guy who learned that power matters more than ideology. And he kept changing mass until someone finally made him dominant. I think we can see several parallels both in the US and in Europe of people who fit the bill, who will do and say whatever they can for the opportunity of gaining power. In fact, the US is dealing with a guy just like that. How many times did Donald Trump try to shift parties and allegiances so that he could obtain power? And it ended up that the Republican Party and Republican voters were the only people stupid enough to hand the reins of power to that guy. And aren't we all surprised that Donald Trump is best buds with Viktor Orbán and loves every dictator on the planet, including Putin and Kim Jong-un? So the saying goes, birds of a feather flock together, and it shouldn't be surprising that Trump, Orbán, Kim Jong-un, Putin, and every other dictator around the world are walking hand in hand as they try to bring forward their version of a fascist utopia. Orbán's story begins as a 26-year-old activist in 1989, and that was a time where Soviet troops were still in Hungary. He publicly called for free elections and the withdrawal of Russian forces. That speech that he gave during the reburial of Imre Nagy made him a national figure almost overnight. At that time, he came out of a liberal background. He was one of the founders of the Fidesz party in 1988, and as a youth movement, it was aimed at regime change. He studied with support tied to George Soros, and he moved in openly liberal political spaces. What's interesting about Orbán's journey is that it mirrors the journey and the messaging of a lot of these billionaires that are funding these movements. Think about all of the tech bro billionaires who rose to power, painting themselves as progressives and liberals, and now they're the ones that are funding most of these far-right fascist regimes around the world and propping up the Republican Party in the US. So when we think about Orbán and how he rose to power by shape-shifting as he needed to consolidate more and more power under his belt. He rose to power by reading the room and by changing costumes faster than any grifter at a county fair. He started out as an anti-communist hero. That gave him power. He looked like the future because he sounded fearless. And he did it at a time where he could have faced real consequences for saying what he said. And then came 1994. That was the first time that Orban learned a really difficult lesson. Those were the early years of democracy in Hungary. And his party, youthful and liberal, got crushed. What that told Orban was that liberalism wasn't the fastest road to power. So what did he do? Just like the billionaire tech bros that you see today, he pivoted. And he pivoted hard to the right. His jeans and scruffy rebel image got swapped out for nationalism, Christianity, family values, and constant talk about the nation, the homeland, the respectable middle-class identity. And this was a calculated move. This wasn't some moral awakening. This was all about maintaining and consolidating power. And that shift worked. In 1998, Fidesz won, and Orban became prime minister. He led Hungary into NATO in 1999, and then at that stage, he still looked like a standard Central European conservative with anti-Soviet credentials. And then it happened again. In 2002, he lost power. And when he came back meaner, more disciplined, and much more interested in building a machine than participating in democracy. The 2006 lie speech scandal involving Ferenc Gyurcsány, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, gave Orban the perfect opening that he needed to consolidate power. He used public anger, image making, and polarization to present himself as the only real voice of the nation. Then came 2010. This is where everything locked into place. Orban won big, he got the numbers that he needed, and he unleashed what the profile basically describes as a legislative tsunami. He packed institutions, rewrote rules, filled states with party loyalists, and tightened control over media and public life. If this sounds like something that we've heard of before, this is basically the playbook that the Republican Party is using as articulated in Project 2025. And it's no surprise that Orban's Danube Institute and the Republicans' Heritage Foundation all have deep ties together and are built on top of each other in terms of executing a fascist vision for the future. Once he got done consolidating power and he had the state bent around him, the foreign policy pivot started, and it followed the same pattern. Just like every other Orban pivot, whatever kept him in power, made him stronger, became the principle that he stuck to. The same guy who blasted Soviet domination early in his career, by the time 2014 rolled around, he was openly praising the illiberal systems Putin had in place, and he used Russia as the model for what he wanted to bring forward in Hungary, not as an academic exercise, but as something that should be put into place and as the model for the right way to move forward. And that's when everything went into overdrive. His government pushed an eastern opening that expanded ties with Russia. He signed long-term agreements with Gazprom, a Russian natural gas pipeline and company, and he backed the Rosatom expansion of Hungary's Pax nuclear plant with a huge loan from Moscow. So let's understand what's happening. The guy who rose to power as an anti-Russian revolutionary and reformer moved Hungary closer to Russian energy and used Russian capital to consolidate power while the rest of Europe was supposed to be reducing dependence on Russia. That's one hell of a pivot. And if what he's doing sounds familiar, it's very similar to what happened with Donald Trump throughout his career, where he's getting bailed out and saved by Russian-aligned entities and financed and propped up until the right moment of opportunity presents itself. So when you think about Orban and his rise and fall, he rose to power as one of Russia's harshest critics in Central Europe. And once he became a leader, he became Russia's Trojan horse inside the EU and NATO. Do you see how that playbook worked out? Who else does that sound like? When we think about what happened with Orban, it's not that his principles changed. He was always power hungry. He was always somebody that was putting on a face, and he was an ultimate opportunist. And that's how he got to where he was. All he did was change the packaging. When it served his purposes to be an anti-communist, that's what he did. When he needed to pretend that he was a liberal to open doors, that's what he did. When it required him to be a nationalist to win votes, that's what he did. When he felt that being a Christian conservative was what will give him the moral authority to do what he wanted, that's what he did. That's how he built his base. And then when he got enough power, he decided, let me align myself with the biggest dictator in my sphere so that I can consolidate and maintain my seat of power. And that gave him a model for maintaining power without any accountability. Orban never abandoned who he was. This has always been who he was. He was never for freedom. He was always for power and control. And when we think about Orban, we need to understand that is who he is. He is just like every other narcissist that's out there. Power hungry and willing to do whatever he can to gain power, maintain it, consolidate it, and perpetuate it. That's who he is. And it shouldn't be surprising why Donald Trump likes him so much, because when he looks at Orban, he's looking in the mirror. The only difference is that Orban actually is competent. So what's the lesson in all of this that we need to understand? The lesson is pretty simple. While we should be happy for the Hungarian people that they have a new leader in place, we also need to be informed by history and understanding that Orban didn't become who he was by being who he was. He started out as someone just like Magyar, someone who promised to bring reforms and someone who was committed to serving the will of the people. And as he got more and more power, that mindset shifted. So while we can be cautiously optimistic that Magyar will actually turn Hungary around, we need to be vigilant to make sure that Magyar doesn't go the same route that Orban does. And the only real way for us to be sure that he is committed to bringing Hungary back into the fold and having it become a liberal democracy is when we see Orban and all of his allies playing the role of human yo-yos. That's what it's going to require for us to be convinced that this guy is really committed to turning the page and dishing out accountability to everyone who needs it.